Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome everybody again to another episode of our show, bringing you another fascinating guest today who is helping to create a better tomorrow, literally for billions of people on the planet. We have the honor today of being joined by none other than Dr. Peter Hotez, Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine and Professor of Pediatrics, Molecular Virology, and Microbiology, Baylor College of Medicine, where he's also the chief section of Pediatric Tropical Medicine, and Texas Children's Hospital Endowed Chair of Tropical Pediatrics. He also serves as Rice University's Baker Institute Fellow in Disease and Poverty and co-director of Parasites Without Borders, a global nonprofit organization with a focus on those suffering from various parasitic diseases in subtropical environments. Dr. Hotez is internationally recognized with his expertise in neglected tropical diseases and vaccine development, leading the only product development partnerships for new vaccines for hookworm, schistosomiasis, and Chagas disease, and is just coming off major wins for emergency approval in India, Botswana, some other countries of his team's Corbevax protein subunit COVID-19 vaccine, of which he and the previous guest on our show, Dr. Elena Bottazzi, were just recently nominated for the Nobel Prize. A lot of exciting things to discuss here. But Dr. Peter Hotez, thank you so much for taking the time to come talk to us a little bit today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, before we jumped on the call today, I pulled down the recent the COVID vaccine figures. Saw numbers: 11.35 billion doses, 4.53 billion people fully vaccinated, but we still have 42% of the world that is not vaccinated yet, and only about 14% of people in low-income countries have at least received one dose. In comes Corbevax. You take us into a little bit of this fascinating story, which goes back actually to your work on not SARS-CoV-2, but SARS-CoV-1 back in 2004, and a little bit of the journey that this fascinating product has taken.
Yeah, you're right. There still remains this global vaccine inequality. It's been difficult to scale up production of the mRNA and adenovirus and particle vaccines. These are new technologies. And we knew this was going to be an issue. And one of the things that we do at our vaccine center is develop vaccines that use a technology that's already widely in place in low and middle income countries. And that is through recombinant protein fermentation in yeast. And that approach is used to make the recombinant hepatitis B vaccine. So in theory, any vaccine producer in a low and middle income country that makes recombinant hepatitis B vaccine in yeast, which is a vegan technology, no animal cells, human cells, animal protein, human protein, can make our vaccine. And those kinds of vaccine producers are in place in Indonesia and Bangladesh and India. The list goes on in Brazil and Argentina and Thailand and Vietnam. And so that's been our approach for our vaccines for poverty-related neglected diseases. As our first choice for technology is to use that, because that way we can ensure it'll actually get used. And we adopted the same approach for coronavirus vaccines about 10 years ago, because that's what we know how to do well, and do it and maximize the yields of the antigens to do it at the lowest possible cost. And so when the COVID-19 sequence came along, that's what we did. And it moved pretty quickly because we had ironed out a lot of the issues with the first SARS vaccine. So when we got the new sequence, we were able to move reasonably quickly, and the stars aligned, it worked well. And then we transferred the technology with no patent to vaccine producers who were interested in working with us from India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and now Botswana. And India has moved very quickly. They've now released a vaccine for emergency use. They're focusing on the unvaccinated kids. So as of today, it's gone into 20 million unvaccinated, 20 million kids 12 to 14 in India since the campaign started last month. And now they're looking at the 5 to 11-year-olds soon. So that's exciting. And then as a booster dose for adults. And then it got approved in Botswana. So things are starting to really accelerate. So it's a very exciting time for us.
It's a fascinating story, and I sit here in downtown Philadelphia, sort of one of the epicenters of U.S. vaccine history. And my next door neighbor for a couple of decades before he passed away happened to be Barry Bloomberg of hepatitis B antigen Nobel fame. And here you are, you're being nominated, and there's shades of Jonas Salk here, and so you can't patent the sun. Say a few words, just if you would, about what this Nobel nomination means to you and your team in general.
Well, I mean, we're holding off on buying airline tickets to Oslo just yet, but it's nice to be nominated, and it's great recognition, and the fact that it's for the Peace Prize is especially meaningful, because one of the things that I've devoted my life to is not only making vaccines for people who live in poverty, but also accelerating what I call vaccine diplomacy, building trust and vaccine development between nations. I served as U.S. science envoy in the Obama administration, and to try to foster U.S. relations with vaccine development in the Middle East and North Africa at a very tough time during the ISIS occupation in 2015, 2016. So it's especially meaningful from that standpoint, and going up against all the anti-vaccine aggression now, which has become such a killer movement here in the United States and now globally.
Yeah, and I didn't mention at the intro that, aside from several books that you published, you have the new one, Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in This Time of Anti-Science. And you sort of coined this term, vaccine diplomacy, where you bring together, as you were saying, you've written about anti-poverty, sort of this moniker that refers to these neglected tropical diseases, how they trap populations. They may not kill as many people as the tuberculosis and the malarias, but they cause substantial misery. And Maria went through some of these numbers on the previous show. The new book sort of connects all sorts of other things that are happening in the world in terms of instability and the migrations, and, as you were saying, the rise of sort of this anti-vaccine movement. Where do you think we're going? And I mean, because we hear about organizations. You write us about some in the book in terms of Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. Obviously, the Gates Foundation, other organizations involved here. We've seen a lot about sort of the U.S. State Department and, of course, Department of Defense involved with Operation Warp Speed. Where do you think we're going with some of the development of this vaccine diplomacy model that you write about in the book?
Well, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I mean, I think we've done a lot's happened over the last 20 years with the formation of the Gavi Alliance to the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization to accelerate pediatric immunizations globally. And this is a partnership with the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and Gates Foundations, and the pharma companies. I think, that's been really great for harnessing the multinational pharma companies to providing vaccines for kids in low and middle income countries. But then we've seen some reversals as well. We've seen reversals in this time of this COVID-19 vaccine inequalities that I think the policymakers went too far in one direction around the multinationals, thinking only the multinationals can do this, and we have to use all brand new technologies for speed and innovation, and got some interesting vaccines for mRNA vaccines and adenovirus and particle vectored vaccines for COVID-19. But there was not that commitment for equity and no commitment to produce vaccines like ours, which could be made locally and ensure it gets delivered to populations in low and middle income countries. So we were actually cut out of Operation Warp Speed and a lot of the G7 initiatives, which was a mistake, because had we had that support earlier, I think we could have been further ahead and maybe prevented the emergence of the Delta variant that came out of an unvaccinated population out of India, or Omicron out of an unvaccinated population in Southern Africa. So not only was it the wrong thing to do from a humanitarian perspective, but it also was not in our enlightened self-interest not to make that commitment to vaccinate the world. But that's what we did. And fortunately, we were able to raise some philanthropy here in Texas and in New York with the JPB Foundation and others. And that made a big difference. But I think had we had the public support from the G7 countries, we might have even been further along. But we're making up for lost time pretty quickly, and now things are moving in the right direction. I think the other big negative determinant around preventing vaccinations is the rise of this very aggressive anti-vaccine movement that started out asserting that vaccines cause autism, and coming out of grassroots groups, and mom and pop groups on Facebook. And it's grown to something much more ominous, and that is it hooked up to political extremism on the far right. And now you've got the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers marching at anti-vaccine rallies, and it's been full on adopted by the House Freedom Caucus of the Republican Party that makes statements like, first they're going to vaccinate you, and then they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles. And as ridiculous as that sounds to us, there's a quarter of the country that believes it. Or Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who calls people who vaccinate medical brown shirts, using inflammatory Nazi analogies. And then it's amplified nightly now on Fox News, and the Fox News anchors at night go after me. And so it's not only targeting the science, but the scientists. So we've seen in this time of COVID a rise of very scary anti-vaccine, anti-science, I don't know what you want to call it, ecosystem or empire that is not going to stop at COVID-19 vaccines. I think it's been enabled, and I'm worried about its spillover impact on other childhood vaccination programs.
One of the areas we talked a little about, Peter, on the show is this topic of One Health and sort of the connections between people and animals and the environment, and sort of the zoonotic viral transfer around the globe, and all the other scary stuff that may still be out there. We've heard these terms about sort of pan-coronavirus vaccine initiatives. You've written a lot about pan-helminthic vaccines, thinking once again about some of these entities that you focus on, and Parasite Without Borders, has obviously this mission of eliminating the suffering due to these parasitic infections. What's the vision about what you're going to be doing there? Obviously you have this basket that you're looking at. If you can get rid of it via some of these novel vaccines, you're really going to improve the lives of hundreds of millions of people in the developing world. What are you doing on sort of the pan-helminthic vaccine front, if you could talk about that a bit?
Well, it's funny. I've been on a bunch of Zoom calls recently. This is something that I've been working on since I was an MD, PhD student in New York at Rockefeller and Cornell. I've always wanted to develop vaccines for parasitic infections. The coronaviruses came much later on, but most of my 40 years in this business has been, or I guess you call it a business, money-losing business, is developing vaccines for diseases like female genital schistosomiasis, which is maybe one of the most common gynecologic conditions on the African continent, affecting adolescent girls and young women that most people haven't heard about. But the estimate is 40 million girls and women are affected by this condition. So we're making that vaccine, and that's now moving into phase 2 clinical trials, and also a vaccine for hookworm infection, which is a huge issue in pregnant women who also get malaria and suffer from profound anemia as a consequence, and also Chagas disease, which is a cause of heart disease caused by a trypanosome parasite that's a big cause of heart disease in Latin America, affecting 6 to 7 million people, and it's now in Texas as well. And so and probably a lot of your listeners never heard of these diseases, and in fact, my first book was called Forgotten People, Forgotten Diseases, about these conditions, which are some of the most common afflictions of humankind, but overwhelmingly in poor countries. And raising awareness about these diseases and how are we making vaccines for them has been a lifelong quest, and also trying to provide access to essential medicines. I worked on a program with David Molyneux, the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, Alan Fennick at Imperial College London, and now more than 1 billion people have received access to those medicines on an annual basis, which, by the way, includes ivermectin. So
Sure.
The irony is, I get accused by the anti-vaccine people of unfairly targeting ivermectin. And I say, look, there's probably no one you're talking to that's responsible for more people on this planet getting ivermectin than I am. And but for good reason. It works for river blindness, which is a parasitic worm infection, and strongyloidiasis and scabies and lymphatic filariasis, but it doesn't work for COVID.
One other, in the twilight of his career, Hilary Krapowski worked around the corner here at Thomas Jefferson University, and in the late 1990s, I went and visited him over there, and at the time, he was working on producing rabies vaccines in a variety of plant species, tobacco, I think tomatoes, some other ones, and there was two goals of his work at the time. One was can plants serve as these inexpensive production systems for vaccine materials? The other was this concept of the edible vaccine, and that in some of these poorer countries where the cold chain doesn't exist and so forth, can we one day create that banana plantation where we produce the schistosomiasis vaccine edibly, and the village comes and eats it, and we vaccinate everybody. I came across an article actually on edible vaccines when you were at Sabin, running the Vaccine Institute there. Any interesting work that you're doing, or your thoughts on sort of that whole area of molecular farming for some of these countries where there is this struggle between getting the high-tech vaccine locally?
It's an interesting idea of using plant technology. We've worked with it a little bit. We partnered with a company known as Fraunhofer, that's in the Wilmington, Delaware area, not too far from you. And they've been engineering tobacco plants in order to produce recombinant proteins, which could include vaccine antigens. So sort of a peacetime use of tobacco, which is an interesting idea. And we partnered with them to make one of our hookworm antigens. It's an exciting idea. I think it has a lot of promise. It's executing it and making it happen is not as straightforward as it sounds in terms of dealing with the production yields and aggregation, and there was some interest, I think, from the Brazilians to see if they could start making yellow fever vaccine in plants, and Brazil, of course, which excels in the agribusiness, could be a good place for it. So I think it hasn't really met the promise yet, but I think in time it might. There is actually one Canadian company, Medicago, that's put the spike protein into plants, into tobacco plants, and I guess it seems to be working. I don't know what kind of scale they can make it at, but I think the World Health Organization has had an issue with them because they're partly financed by one of the big tobacco companies. I forget if it was Reynolds or Philip Morris or something like that. So that creates a lot of ethical issues for WHO, but and others. And so, but I do think in principle, the idea of engineering plants, whether it's edible vaccines or you just use the plant technology to make the protein and give it by conventional means, sure, why not? Why not exploit that kind of thing?
Gotcha. Perfect. While I have you, obviously, aside from everything that you're doing with Corbevax and obviously the NTD program, you've become a bit of a superstar in the last couple of years on CNN with one of the main faces of education, re-education in the area of the benefits of vaccines. Can you just say a couple of words on how this all came about? I mean, did Wolf Blitzer call you up one day and say, "Can you come talk on the show?" How did you become such a a superstar on CNN the last couple of years. See me there pretty much every day now.
Well, it's not just CNN; it was also
Sure.
NBC, is
Right.
MSNBC, and also BBC. And I was even going on Fox News for a while until I had to call out the president for in 2020 for the disinformation around COVID-19. But even then, the daytime anchors hung in there with me for a while. You know, I've always had a foot planted in public engagement. So even beginning as far back as the anthrax attacks in Washington, back in after 9/11, I'd been talking a lot to the press about public issues, and then did it again, and sort of went in spurts. So with H1N1 in 2009, and then interestingly, when I moved from Washington, D.C., I used to be chair of microbiology at George Washington University. When I moved to Houston and the Texas Medical Center in 2011, I thought, well, I'm going to the Texas Medical Center because of the scientific horsepower of the Texas Medical Center, and I'd sort of lose my national profile. But I was willing to do that to up my scientific game. But then, you know, Ebola hit Dallas in 2014, and then Zika hit South Texas in 2016, and it didn't happen. So I'd already been sort of known to the cable news channels for a while. But then, you know, when 2020 hit, I was one of the few Americans that was actually been working on coronavirus vaccines for 10 years. And so it made for a natural fit. And it's something I find meaningful. It's not something I was formally trained to do. As I say, it's more trial and error, with a lot more error than trial. But one of the things that I try to do on the cable news networks is take the role of being a scientist very seriously, and use that to educate the public about the scientific basis of some of these decisions. I think that's sometimes the weakness of the way the communications coming out of the White House or the federal agencies, including CDC, is they kind of give these summary statements, but don't go into detail what the underlying assumptions are. And assuming I get the time to do that, that's what I try to do. And I think generally it's been well received. You know, the key is not to lapse into a lot of jargon and to be able to go into some depth and detail, because people's lives depend on it, or their families' lives depend on it, but not use too much jargon. And you know, it depends. Some my appearances are more successful than others, depending on how much time you get. If it's something quick and you're at the end of the hour and the producer's got to finish up and they're shouting wrap up, doc, in your earphone, then it's not as successful. But sometimes you get some long periods of time. That's why I like doing podcasts with people like you, because you get a little more time, it's a little more relaxed, a little more time to explain a few things.
Absolutely. Well, I know we're coming up on the quarter of the hour. I know you have a lot of other things to get to, but I just really, I want to thank you for doing this, really rooting you on, not just with everything that you have going on with NTDs and Corbevax, but I have my fingers crossed that you're going to be over in Oslo soon and with Dr. Bottazzi, and it's just been really, really impressive watching you the last couple of years. So really thanking you for coming on the show. For everybody that is going to be listening or watching on the podcast, you've been listening to Dr. Peter Hotez, Dean, National School of Tropical Medicine, Baylor College of Medicine. Please check out his new book, Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Anti-Science. Peter, once again, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule, and this was last minute. Obviously, thank you for everything you're doing there. And as we say on this show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for so many people via what you do. You're really fascinating story.
Well, thank you again. And the kind of science communication you're doing is so important. And that's why when you gave me the opportunity, I was eager to join you.
Great to have you. Good seeing you.